We'll say good morning. I don't know what happened with the computer this morning. It doesn't seem to be cooperating, so I'll have to learn the old-fashioned way without a computer. All right. So says the Gemara. We're up to Daf Zayin. Daf Zayin. We're going to actually pick up on the last line of Vav Amud Beis. So the Gemara says the following: Mosar Nazir Linedava. So remember, the Mishnah said that if you had put aside money for karbanos for Nazirus, so ultimately, if there's any leftover monies, those monies go to Nidava. They go to Nidava, and again, I obviously I'm not going to explain anymore, but to explain it one last time, Nidava ultimately means that fund, what we call Ketz HaMizbeach, the dessert fund for the altar. That should there ever be a moment where the altar is dormant, ultimately you can go ahead and purchase karbanos from there. So most are nazir lenadava. Rav Chisda says, top of Zayin, v'hu shekirva chataso besof. This is very interesting. We'll say, if you look at the tiklin charatin, v'hu shekiriv chataso lebasof. So he writes, shahanazir mevi gimel behemos. A nazir brings three different karbanos. A nazir brings three different karbanos. Chatos, Ola, Ushlamim. A chatos, an Ola, and Shlamim. Ukeshehikriv chatoso lebasof. And when he ultimately brings his chatos in the end, V'hu moser chatosu de ka'amar, de mosro nedava, va'amas disen kai. So Rav Chisda makes a very interesting qualification. So now a Nazir is going to bring a chatos, an Ola, and the Shlamim. So Rav Chisda says, when do we say that the leftover monies from a Nazir are ultimately used for Nedava? That's when the last carbon that he brought of his three was his chatos. Why? What does that have to do with anything? Because then we essentially view the monies as leftover chatos monies, and as the Mishnah says, leftover chatos monies go to Nedava. But for argument's sake, so essentially what Rav Chisda is saying is, if you have leftover monies are considered to be leftover of the last carbon you offered. So depending ultimately on what the last carbon you offered was, that would determine what you do with the leftover funds. Aval, top of Zayin Amud Aleph. Aval, however, I karvo shlamim, if you were to go ahead and offer up your shlamim lebasov at the end of the sacrificial order over here, then mosran shlamim. Then indeed the leftover funds would be used for shlamim, as indeed is the halach. If you have money set aside for shlamim, and then there's leftover monies, that monies ultimately can only be used for shlamim. Amar Rab Zira. Rab Zira disagrees with Rav Chisda and says, not true. Afilu karvu shlamim lebasov. It's not true. You can't start doing this with Nazirus, because then you're going to have different circumstances or different halachas in different circumstances. Rather, Rab Zira says, even if you offered shlamim last, meaning not chatos last, halacha achasi benazir shetihiyeh mosara nidava. There is one standardized halacha by Nazir that says what? Any leftover funds are always going to go into the nidava fund. So both say fundamental machlokes Rav Chisda and Rav Zira. Rav Chisda ultimately saying that again the leftover monies from Nazir only go to nidava when the last carbon that's offered is a chatos, and Rav Zira is saying no, that ultimately goes to Nadava, even if it doesn't matter which is the last carbon, it's just halacha achas, standard operating procedure. Masnisa misayeh ledin, umasnisa misayeh ledin. There is a brisa that supports this opinion, Rav Chisda, and there's a brisa that supports this opinion, Rav Zira. So he says, misayeh ledin, brisa misayeh ledin, brisa masis misayeh ledin. Masnisa misayeh Rav Zira. So what is the brisa that supports Rabbi Zira? He said, what is the brisa? Remember, Rabbi Zira's opinion was that it doesn't matter what the order of the karbanos are, the leftover funds of the Nazir always go to Nedava. So what's the brisa that supports him? So Elohein, the brisa says, Elohein ma'os stumin. These are considered to be, we'll say ma'os stumin means unspecified funds. Kol shedinei chatos mesos mu'uravos bahen. Any time that you have a collection of money, and there is money ultimately of which chatos that died are included in that. Afilu hifrish dmei chatos misocha maos stuminhin. Even if you removed the chatos money from among this bunch. So ultimately, the remaining monies are still considered to be ma'os stumin. And we'll say ma'os stumin is another way of saying leftover sacrificial money that's going to go into the nedava fund. So what do you see from here? That according to what the Beis says, that even if you have monies of mixed karbanos, and ultimately you remove the chatos money first, the rest of the fund still goes into nedava, which indicates to us what Rabbi say, that lemaisa, it doesn't matter the order which the karbanos are offered, still it's going to go to nedava. So that's the brisa that supports Rabbi Zira. Masnisa Misaya the Rav Chisda. There's a brisa that supports Rav Chisda. Elu lachatasi. If a person has a bunch of money, and he says these monies are for my chatos, v'hashar l'shar nizirusi. And what happens? And the rest of these monies are for the rest of my karbanos nazir. So also remember, like we said before, a nazir has to bring 3 karbanos: a chatas, an ola, and the shlamim. So what happens? The nazir is at the end of his term. He actively separates some money from the pile, and he says, "This is for my chatas, and the rest will satisfy the rest of my obligations for my shlamim and my ola." And what happens? And then he dies. So what is the halacha? So the Brisa says, Mo'alin bekulan ve'in mo'alin b'miktsasan. So this is very interesting. You can only commit mi'ilah if you use all of the money, but you can't commit mi'ilah if you only use some of the money. Now, what's the pshat with that? Interestingly enough, you can only violate the laws of mi'ilah with what we call kodshei kadoshim, with higher order sacrificial items. But there is no concept of mi'ilah by kodshim kalim, lower sanctity items. So for example, a carbon ola is a kodshei kadoshim, is higher orders, which also makes sense because nothing of it is consumed, as opposed to, let's say, chatos or shlamim, where ultimately those are kodshim kalim. So listen to this case. So now all of I went ahead, Nazir went ahead, separated out some funds for the chatos, said the rest of the money in the pile for the rest of my karbanos, but he didn't offer anything, he died. So now the Brisa says the only way you commit mi'ilah is how? Is if ultimately you go ahead and you use all of the money together. But if you only used some of the monies, then what? Then lemaisa, what that shows is, if you only use some of the money, it's possible that the money that you used was kodshei kalim money, and therefore not subject to mi'ilah. It's only if you use all of the money at once that you've definitely violated mi'ilah, because all of the money by definition also includes what? Money of kodshei kadoshim, of ola money, and therefore you be subject to mi'ilah. But I will say, so what's the chap over here? Velo amar, imes yiplu l'nedava. And yet, what doesn't the Brisa say? The Brisa doesn't say that in this case, when the Nazir dies, all of the money falls into the Nedava fund. And I will say, according to Rav Chisda, why doesn't the Brisa say that if the Nazir died, all of the money falls into the Nedava fund? Because remember, what's the case of the Brisa? You've separated out chatos first, and the remaining monies are therefore ola and shlamim. So Rav Chisda's position is what Rabbi say. The only time that leftover monies of a Nazir are going to the Nedava fund is when the chatos was the last thing separated, because then we view the remaining monies as leftover chatos monies. But clearly, again, if the chatos is separated first, the leftover monies are not considered chatos money, and therefore they don't fall into the Nedava fund. So both say again, both Rav Chisda and Rav Zira have brisos that respect their respective opinions. Rav Chisda says similarly. I both say you should know the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Zira. Namely that halacha achos lekulan. We have one standardized law by Nazir. We don't say that it depends which carbon you offered first. The halacha concerning Nazir is if there's any leftover monies from what the Nazir collected for his karbanos, those monies, doesn't matter the order in which he separated for the karbanos, those monies fall into the Nedava fund. So now that we started with Nazir, the Gemara says, Rav Chisda says, Mosar lachmo shel Nazir yurkav. Rav Chisda says the leftover monies of the bread of a Nazir are left to rot, which I will say again is another way of saying that Lemaisa, a Nazir had to bring certain loaves also with his certain lechem, ultimately with his carbon, and therefore if there's any leftover bread, literally it's left to rot. But remember, this could also be true with money, that if there's any leftover monies, those monies are also not used for anything else. Amar Rabbi Yossi says, V'yayos, and this is true. Why? Because what are you supposed to do with the leftover nazir bread? You can't offer it by itself. Because there's no thing as a sacrifice of bread by itself. To go ahead and, let's say, offer these loaves to another nazir for him to use with his karbanos, that doesn't work. Because you can't establish a karban naziros without bread. So meaning every nazir has to bring his own bread. Therefore, lefum kach tzarich meimar. Therefore, based on this, we'd have to say lachmo shel nazir yorkav. That there's really only one choice left. That when there's leftover bread of a nazir, you just allow it to sit and rot. Savrin meimar. Based on this, we thought to say savrin meimar hu. Lachmo mosar. I'm sorry. Let me read that again. Savrin meimar hu lachmo hu mosar nesachav. Now I would have thought to say based on this that the same that is true for the bread is also true for any type of wine leftover. I also remember some karbanos came with nisachim wine libations. So I might have been tempted to say that Lamai says same law, which is that the same way that when there's leftover bread you have to let it rot, can't use it for anything else. If there's leftover wine, you also have to leave it alone. Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bun, Mosar Nesachav Kodshe Kadoshim Inun, Vieplu Linadava. To which Rabbi Yossi said in the name of Rabbi Bun, no. The difference with wine is leftover wine is considered to be Kodshe Kadoshim, and therefore the funds ultimately fall into the Nadava fund. Al Daite de Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bun, Shmuel Aliba de Rav Chisda, Shmuel Aliba de Rav Chisda, Shloshtan Amru Davar Echad. So we'll say, listen to this. So now the Gemara is going to say the following, that there are these three opinions that ultimately said the same thing. Namely, Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bun, and interestingly enough, if you look at the Tikkun Charatin, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Bun, Tikkun Charatin writes, Da Amar b'Shem Rav Chisda, De Mosar Nesachim Yiplu Linedava. So Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Bun is the one who said that leftover nesachim, leftover wine, and so when we say wine, what we really mean over here is money. Money set aside for nesachim ultimately falls into the Nadava fund because they are Kadshe Kadashim. So what we're going to see now is that the following opinions all pretty much stated the same concept, which is that when you have an object that is Kadshe Kadashim, that ultimately the leftover funds from that fall into the Nadava fund. So Al Daite Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bun, Shmuel Aliba de Rav Chisda. Now, both again, the Gra omits the last line over here. B'mosar nesachim, b'mosar nechasim Rabbi. If it's really supposed to be Rav Chisda, Shloshtan Amru Davar Echad. So both the Gemara is suggesting over here, Rabbi Yossi, Shmuel, and Rav Chisda all said the same thing. What did they say? So Rav Chisda Amar, Rav Chisda Ahan, the Amran Shmuel, the Am Rabbi Yossi, Ad Da'ana Taman, Shamis called Rabbi Yehuda Sha'il Shmuel. I heard Rabbi Yehuda ask Shmuel, Hifrish Shiklo Umeis, Amar Le Yiplu Linadava, that if a person went ahead and separated out his half shekel and he died, then what happens? The leftovers go, not the leftovers, meaning the shekel, goes into the Nadava fund. Rabbi Elazar Omer, Moser Asiris Ha'efa Shalo. Rabbi Elazar says that the leftover of the Kohen Gadol's mincha offering, Rabbi Yochanan Omer Liolichim Liyamelach, you have to throw it into Yamelach, can't get any benefit from it. And Rabbi Elazar Omer Yiplu Linadava. And Rabbi Elazar says, no, ultimately it goes into the Nadava fund. So both say again, the point over here is the common denominator among these three things between, again, Nisachim, Shekel, and Mincha of the Kohen Gadol is that all three of them are treated as Kodshe Kadoshim. Interesting, we'll see how shekel is treated as Kadshe Kadashim, because it's very interesting, because Kadshe Kadashim we normally associate with karbonos. Here the Gemara suggests that shekel itself has a status of Kadshe Kadashim. But the point over here is these three opinions, in three different cases, Nesachim wine, leftover wine libations, shekel, the individual who separated half shekel then died, or the mincha of the Kohen Gadol, that let's say is left over. In these three opinions hold that in these three cases, the leftover goes into the Nadava fund, and therefore all subscribe to the common idea that any leftover Kadshe Kadoshim always fall for Nadava. Says the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah. Well, said this is actually the next amud and a half is actually going to be great. I mean, it's all great, but this is actually a little bit more interesting. Halacha l'maisa as well. Mosar shavuyim l'shvuyim. I will say the topic of the Mishnah is when you collect money for a certain cause, what do you do with the surplus funds from the collection? So, because remember, we're coming off the heels of the previous Mishnah. Previous Mishnah was always speaking about leftover funds from sacrificial items. So now we're transitioning from sacrificial items to tzedakah. So let's say I collected money to redeem captives, and now there's extra money. I needed $2,000 to redeem the captives, and it turns out now I raised $2,500. So now what do I do with the extra $500? So the Mishnah says, if there's leftover money for shvuyim, that money is earmarked for shvuyim. You can only use it for the redemption of captives. And ultimately, again, if you don't need it right now, you put it in the shvuyim fund, and you'll unfortunately have to use it sometime in the future. Most are shavui, the osa shavui. But if you collected money, I will say, to redeem a particular captive. So let's say, again, I raised money to redeem Ruvain, then what? The surplus funds are actually given to Ruvain. So let's say, again, his redemption, I was able to get him redeemed for $2,000. We raised $2,500. That extra $500 goes to Ruvain himself. Moser aniyim, la'aniyim. If you collect money for the poor and there are surplus funds, those monies have to remain earmarked for the poor. So we'll say, Moser ani la'osa ani. Similarly, if I raised money for a particular poor person and it turned out that I raised more money than I initially needed, then what? The leftover funds ultimately go to that ani. So also what the Mishnah is saying is, when you raise tzedakah funds for a particular purpose, you may not switch their purpose if you have surplus funds. Whether that's true that you collected in a general sense, or whether it's true you collected in a personal sense. The money collected, even if above and beyond the targeted amount, is ultimately given to either the intended purpose or the intended beneficiary. Bosa mesim lemesim. If I raised money to take care of the burial needs of someone, and again I raised more than necessary, that money remains the property of the dead, which means again it goes into the burial fund and I use it for future burials. Mosa hameis liyarshav. Ultimately, if you go ahead and if I raise money for a particular person who died, particular burial expenses, and then it turns out that there's more money than needed, the remaining money goes to the heirs of the deceased. Rabbi Meir says, So we'll say, interesting enough, Rabbi Meir says that no, when it comes to the leftover money for burial expenses, you should leave it until Eliyahu Hanavi comes, which is another way of saying we're not exactly sure what to do with it. Now, what's interesting is, we'll say, if you look at the Karban Ha'ida, so the Karban Ha'ida is on the left-hand side. So you see right towards the middle of it, it says Halacha Ches. Then it says Mishnah. So look where it says Liyehi Munach Achiyavo Elio Misafkale Imachil Hames Ziluse Legabe Yershav Olo Hilchach Yehi Munach. So I'll say it's a very interesting idea. The question is that to collect for one's burial needs obviously is an embarrassing thing. The mace, so to speak, is mochel on his covered, so to speak. Meaning that the mace understands he has to get buried, so he's mochel on his covered. But ultimately, the shaila is, can the mace be mochel on the covered of the yarshim, that they should be getting tzedakah from the community as well. So therefore, Rabbi Meir says, munach ad shavuot, you should leave it until Eliyahu Hanavi comes. Rabbi Nassim says, Mosra hameis bonon lo nefesh al kivro. Rabbi Nassim says, no. If there's leftover monies, what we use that money for is to put a stone on top of the grave. So again, because remember, even though we only raised for burial expenses now, but lemaisa, again, we go ahead and we use the leftover monies for the mace himself. Gavulo becheskas shu'einlo v'nimtza sheyeshlo. So we'll say is an interesting case. Let's say this is specifically talking about over here where they are collecting money l'tzarchei hames. So let's say it turns out that we collected money for tzarchei hames for a person who died because he thought he didn't have, but it turns out what? That he did have, that he does have. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Savar meimar moser hames liyarshav. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, well, maybe the money should go to the heirs. Because after all, what did the Mishnah say? If you go ahead and you raise money to take care of the burial expenses, and it turns out that you raised excess funds, what do you do with the excess funds? You give it to the heirs. So Rabbi will say, so this could be a similar case. We raised excess funds, not totally excess funds, because it turns out that the mace had. So we'll give it to the Yarshim. Amrle Rabbi Idi the Chutra. Rabbi Idi from Chutra is a place, said to Rabbi Yirmiyah, Haga Atzmacha. Now I will say, Haga Atzmacha is an interesting Lasson over here. If you take a look at the Tiklin Chadatin. So again, I will say, I apologize, we're going to jump back and forth a little bit between the carbon Aid and Tiklin Chadatin. On the right-hand side, first wide line on the bottom and the Tiklin Chadatin. Haga atzmecha kilomar ta'ayin bazeh v'timtza dilo damya hadadi. So we'll say, Rav Idi of Chutra says to Rabbi Yirmiyah, what are you talking about? Haga atzmecha literally means examine your words. Now, that's a sharp statement. It's not just saying simply I disagree with you. It's saying I think what you're saying is so fundamentally flawed. Dilo kivnan elalei. That wasn't the point of the collection. When we collected for the burial needs of Reuven, it was for Reuven. The intent of the community and the intent of the funds was not to raise money for his children. If we need to raise money for his children, we'll do that differently. But what Rav Idi Chutra said is, you can't just switch monies from their intended purpose. The intended purpose was for the mace, not for the arshim. It's different. Bro, so remember, there's one thing to say that surplus funds collected for the mace go to the arshim, because then you can say that's the das. See, this whole idea is predicated on the idea that people don't expect their money back if it turns out that you raise surplus funds. Rather, people understand, just give it to the next, just either keep it for the next event, or ultimately, again, let's say in the case of the mace, give it to the Yarshim. But Lemaisa, again, to collect, and not to use it for that intended purpose at all, but now to give it to the Yarshim, Rav Idi of Chutra says, that's ridiculous. So also listen to this. Rabbi Yirmiyah says something very interesting. He's Rabbi Amar, so Rabbi Yirmiyah responds, calm down. Anna lo amris. I wasn't saying it as a halacha. I was just simply talking out loud. Right? The question was posed as to what do we do if we collect for a mace who we thought didn't have money, but in reality does have money. And I was just thinking aloud about what you could do with this. I wasn't trying to paskin. Halacha l'maisa, calm down. At minolacha. But you, on the other hand, Rav Idi of Chutra, you seem quite resolute in your position, namely that, again, it doesn't go to the Arshim, but rather, right? So tell me, where do you get your position from? Tani b'shem Rabbi Nisan, Moser Hameis Yivnelo. I'm sorry, so that's it. So he leaves it like that. So he retorts back to Rav Idi the Chutra. Again, I was just talking out loud. You seem quite resolute, and I'll ask you, where do you get your position from? And that's where that stops. Okay. Tani b'shem Rabbi Nisan, Moser Hameis Yivnelo Nefesh Al Kivro. So Rabbi Nisan writes that if you have leftover monies, you raised money for the burial expenses, and you have leftover monies, you use the leftover monies to put a monument, to erect a stone on top of the kever. The Ya'aselo Ziluf Al Gabe Mitaso. Also, it's very interesting. They had a fascinating practice, which was that they would sprinkle wine on the funeral beer. Now we see a couple of things like this. They also used to put sometimes hadassim on the funeral beer, so that was by tzaddikim. So it seems like some of these things were also done to make sure that there was no foul odor. Right? So they would sprinkle wine on top of. Now apparently, again, this was more of like funeral beer, bed, like the beer is what they carry the mace on, BIER. So studying for the SATs. So what's interesting over here? So they used to sprinkle this. So apparently, this is more a luxury item. I don't know if you call a luxury item by a funeral, but again, this was not a necessity of the funeral. So the point that Rabbi Nisan is making now is, in the event that you have surplus funds, you could use it for these type of additional practices. However, Tani. So now also listen to this. Tani. Ein podin shavui b'shavui. You can't go. I will say, look at the carbon ha'ida for just a moment over here. Left hand side again. Ein podin shavui b'shavui. Im gavu maos litzorech shavui zeh. If you raise money for a particular captive, aser l'shanoso litzorech shavui acher. You can't change it to collect for another captive. Va'afilu hasheni adif meharishon. Even if what? Even if the second one is more important than the first one. I will say, again, let's say a communal leader is kidnapped, not by his own balabatim, but I'm saying by others. So again, you might have a communal leader who's more important or more necessary than a regular person. But if you raise money for the regular person, you have to redeem them. So again, if you raise money for a particular captive, can't use it for someone else. Similarly, the ein govin talis patalis. Look at the carbon aida again. Im gavu maos liknos bahen talis zeh. Asr lishanoso liknos bahen talis acher. If you collected money to purchase a particular item for an individual, you can't go ahead and then change the designation of those funds to go ahead and purchase something else. However, look how the Gemara ends. Ve'ein memachin biyad parnosim lakach. But we do not go ahead and literally object in the hands of the Gabbai Tzedakah who does this. I will say, look at the Karban Ha'ida again. Ve'ein memachin biyad parnosim. Ve'ein agaboin la'asos kach. Lishanos hatzedakos lemashet tzrichin osen biyoser. So I'll say it's very interesting. What comes out from this sugya is the following: that lemaisa, when you collect for a particular cause, the money is earmarked for that cause, and no one really has the right to change that money into something else. So whether, again, if you're collecting for a general cause, the money remains earmarked for the general cause. If you're collecting for a particular individual, that money remains earmarked for the individual, even if you have surplus funds above and beyond what you were collecting for, that goes to the individual. Yet the Gemara ends off with an interesting footnote, which is, but often the Gaboy Tzedakah, those in charge of Tzedakah, do switch funds, and we do not object. So we'll say, what does that mean? That what it really comes down to is the following: that when you contribute, what the Gemara seems to feel is when you contribute tzedakah, what you're doing is you're contributing to a cause, but what else are you doing? You are vesting the person with whom you gave it to with the authority to do the right thing with the money. So yes, you're asking me for a particular cause, and that's what I'm contributing to, but it's almost like understood that in the event that for some reason, should there be additional funds or should there have to be some type of logical, important switch, we vest the Gabbai Tzedakah with the ability to do so. So on one hand, again, there is the purest halacha which says it only goes to what it was collected for, but there's the understanding that the das of people when they give is that, because the truth is it's true, you never give, meaning people rarely just give to a cause. People give to a cause that has a solid person behind it. If I don't know who's running something or who's doing something, it could be the most bless you, it could be the most compelling cause. It could be the most compelling cause, but ultimately I'm not going to give it. So because we vest the Gabbai Tzedakah with this authority, sometimes in times of need, the Gabbai Tzedakah does have the right to go ahead and switch monies for other purposes. Fine. Says the obviously other Tzedakah purposes. So says the Gemara, Tani, Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer, Ein osin nefashal tzadikim. It's a beautiful Gemara. Reb Shimon Gamliel says we do not make gravestones or grave markers for tzadikim. Why not? Divreihem hein zichronon. So beautiful, because their words are their ultimate memorials. So you will say, what's the chap of a gravestone? It's there to memorialize a person. It's there to go ahead and ultimately that the person shouldn't be forgotten. So the Reb Shimon Gamliel says the amazing part is tzaddikim don't need stones to be remembered. Tzaddikim, what they're remembered by are their words. So obviously I will say we still make ultimately stones for tzaddikim also, because the truth is for us stones serve a different purpose as well, which is to demarcate a grave. So even if I don't need the stone to trigger my memory about the important individual, I do need to know that it is a grave here, as we saw before, in order to be able to, for a variety of different reasons. Rabbi Yochanan, as well as the Gemara tells a story. Rabbi Yochanan havi misamech va'azil va'al Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So we'll say Rabbi Yochanan was walking and he was leaning on Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So we'll say we've seen elsewhere that Rabbi Yochanan was a large man. If you look at Tiklin Charatin, he says Rabbi Yochanan haya misamech haya tomech v'nasa alav umipnei she Rabbi Yochanan haya bal basar kedarmina bebrachos. So we'll say one or two possibilities. Either he was hard of what's the word? Not blind, but he had impaired vision, either impaired vision, or the truth seems to be elsewhere where he was very heavy. So because of that, when he walked, he needed assistance. So Rabbi Yochanan is leaning on Rabbi Chia bar Abba, and what happens? He sees Vahaya Rabbi Eliezer Chamele or Mitamerle. And what happens? Rabbi Eliezer is walking by. He sees Rabbi Yochanan, and he sees him Chamele, and then he goes and he hides from Rabbi Yochanan. So he doesn't greet Rabbi Yochanan, rather he quickly goes to hide from Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan sees this, and he says, Halin tarti milayhu hadein bavla avidbi. This Babylonian, this is now Rabbi Yochanan referring to Rabbi Eliezer, this Babylonian wronged me in two ways. Number one, Chada, Delo sha'al bishlame. Number one, he didn't ask me how I'm doing. I also remember Rabbi Eliezer was Rabbi Yochanan's Talmud. So that's what makes this circumstance strange. So the Rabbi says, I'm angry, I'm upset at my Talmud for two reasons. Number one, he didn't greet me when he saw me. And number two, v'chanda mitamer. Why did he hide from me? So Amrli Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi. So also Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi said to Rabbi Yochanan, Kach nihigin gavhon deziira, kach nihigin gavon. This is how the Babylonian Jews act. Deziira lo sha'al bishlome dirabba. That someone of a lower stature does not inquire about the welfare of someone of a higher stature. So Rabbi Eliezer would not ask how you're doing because where he comes from, that's actually a sign of disrespect. Di'inon nagon umekaimon. Excuse me. The lo sha'al b'shlomi dirabba. Di'inon nagon umekaimon. This is their practice. So because they fulfill the pasuk, ra'uni na'arim. The lads have seen me. V'nechba'u, and they hide. The yeshishim kamu amdu, but the elders, they stand tall, or they stand before me. So also what he's quoting over here is the pasuk from Eov. Apparently in Bavel, they used to model themselves after this practice of ra'u na'arim v'nechba'u. So when the young ones see me, they run and hide, out of reverence, not out of disrespect. So therefore they were trying to make Rabbi Yochanan feel better. Rabbi Eliezer is not ignoring you. He's just simply conforming to the social code of where he comes from. Amrle, so now I'll say, interestingly enough, Rav Yaakov Bar Idi brings up another discussion, but what you're going to see is relevant to what just occurred. So he says, Amrlehu, mahuleme avar kame da'adura tzameh. What is the halacha? Can you pass by the adura idol? They will say, what Rav Yaakov Bar Idi was asking Rav Yochanan is there a problem just walking by an idol? Is walking by an idol in and of itself a sign of respect or not? So Amrle, ma'at poligle. Yekar avor kamui. This is what's the problem? There is no honor being given by just simply walking by something. Sami inuye. You could go ahead and literally means rub out its eyes, which is another way of saying no. If you just walk by something and you don't actually pay attention to it, that's actually what? That's actually not only is it not respect, but it's actually disrespect. So Rav Yaakov Bar Idi says exactly. Amar le Yeos. Now you understand. Rabbi Eliezer Avid. Now you understand why Rabbi Eliezer would not come before you. Now I will say, if you put these two things together, what you have is the following. Rabbi Eliezer was not going to inquire about the welfare of his Rebbe. Why? Because ultimately in Bavel, that's not how they rolled. Right? Ultimately in Bavel, the younger one did not inquire about the welfare of a more important person. Therefore, what would end up happening? Rabbi Eliezer would end up walking right by Rabbi Yochanan, and as Rabbi Yochanan just said by his own halachic admission, walking by something without acknowledging it is disrespectful. Therefore, what Rav Yaakov Bar Idi is trying to say is, Rabbi, don't get upset. Rabbi Eliezer was actually trying to act in the most bakavadik way by ultimately hiding. Va'od. So Rabbi Yochanan says, but I'm still upset. Va'od avid habavla. This Babylonian does another thing. The lo amar shmaita bishmishmei. That I know whenever he relates my teachings, because remember Rabbi Eliezer is Rabbi Yochanan's student, whenever he relates my teachings, he does not relate my teachings in my name. In my name. He just simply relates them without attribution. We'll see why Rabbi Yochanan was makbid on attribution. So nichnesu lefan of Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi. Amrulo Rebbe, kach hayamaisiva beis knesset shel tarsiim. So I will say, Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi walk in, and they are everybody's trying to calm down Rabbi Yochanan. So he say, Rabbi, don't get upset. Because you know what happens when you get upset? Bad things happen. And they tell the story that happened in the shul of the Tarsiim. Tarsiim is a group of people. The shul of Tarsiim, bin nagar sheyesh baroso glustra. So we'll say this is a case, we actually saw this case in Masechah Shabbos, of a nagar. A nagar literally is like a doorstop. But it's a doorstop that has a larger, how to describe it, like a wider piece on top. So what would happen is you'd put this in the door to keep the door from opening, but technically speaking, it could also be used for a mortar and pestle. Because the top is wider, you could use it to ultimately grind things up. So there's machlokes in Shabbos in terms of whether or not such an item is muktzah. Is it muktzah or not? So the Gemara says that they were having this argument in the shul of the Tarsiim. Beglustera, right? Berosho shaglustera. Shenechlaku amud beis. Shenechlaku Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi had a machlokes about this. Ad shekaru sefer Torah b'chamasan, until as a result of their argument, they tore a sefer Torah in their anger. So the Gemara says, Karu Sakadaitcha, could it mean that they actually tore a Sefer Torah? Ela Shenikra Sefer Torah. Rather, what it means is what? A Sefer Torah was torn. I will say, if you could imagine the scene, what was happening over here? Remember, they used to learn out of scrolls. So what was happening? Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi are arguing about it. And what do you do when you're arguing with someone? You're looking in the text, and what ends up happening? This one pulls this way, this one pulls that way, and and it tears. So as a result of the fact that things got so heated, they actually ended up tearing a sefer. V'haya sham zakin echad, and there was one elder who was present while this whole thing was unfolding. V'Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma shmo, and his name was Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, and he said, Amar timihani im lo hava beis hakneses zeh beis avodah zara. I will be shocked if this shul doesn't ultimately turn into a house of idolatry. Meaning, I will say, when Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma saw just the anger and animosity that was occurring within the walls of the shul, he said, I have no doubt that this place will not endure. Not only will it not endure, but ultimately with this type of negative energy, this place will turn into a Beis Avodah Zarah. So we'll say they were trying to go ahead. They were trying to go ahead and calm down Rabbi Yochanan. See, Rabbi Yochanan, as upset as you may be, anger is not going to have a positive benefit in this circumstance.
Anger associated with the Avodah Zarah.
Correct. That's the whole idea also, that Gemara says, Kala kois kilove Avodah Zarah. I think... Yes, so I saw somebody quote that idea also. Yeah, here, Tiklin Charitin. Baruch Shekivanta. So look at the Tiklin Charitin on the left-hand side. It says, Beis HaKnesses Zeh Avodah Zarah, Mishum Kol HaKoes Ki'ilu Oved Avodah Zarah. Baruch Shekivanta. Right, so Tiklin Charitin says, because the Gemara says, whoever gets angry, it's as if you worship idolatry. I will say, the logic behind that is, when a person gets angry, truth is a person really can't think of anything else but themselves and of their anger. So meaning they negate everything, the Gemara says, including the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore they're trying to calm down Rabbi Yochanan. So what happens? Chazer v'amar hakadein mechavrei. Take a look at the Tiklin Charatin. Hakadein mechavrei. So this is Rabbi Yochanan responding. He says, Kolomar, Mashe'ira kach, that episode that happened in the shul of the Tarsim, b'chaverim hu di'ira. That happened with peers. Umay midamis la sha'ani kois al Rabbi Elazar shehu talmidi. So ultimately, Rabbi Yochanan says, you know what? It's not really a good comparison. Why? Because these two individuals, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi, were peers. So when you're a peer, you have to be careful with how you treat your peer. But a Rebbe has a right to expect a certain level of behavior from his Talmud, and when he does not get that level of behavior, he has the right to be upset. And Abosai, again, remember, part of also being upset is the element of chinuch as well. It's important to... We only know if we're doing something wrong, usually, if someone tells us. Otherwise, if I don't know, if I'm doing something wrong, I might not know what's wrong until somebody points out. So Rabbi Yochanan saying, you don't understand, this is my Talmud. He owes me a certain amount of respect because he's my Talmud. He's not displaying it. And therefore, again, I have actually a right and maybe even an imperative to be upset with him. Nichnas lefanav Rav Yaakov bar Idi. So also listen to this. So Rav Yaakov bar Idi comes along and says the following. Amar Leah, he says, Rebbe, I'm going to tell you why you shouldn't be upset. Ksiv kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe avdo, kein tziva Moshe es Yoshua. So we'll say the pasuk says, this is in Yoshua, that as HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded Moshe his servant, so too Moshe commanded Yoshua. And the Navi goes on to say, by the way, V'chein asa Yoshua lo hisir davar mikol asher tziva Hashem es Moshe. And Yoshua did everything that God had commanded Moshe. Now says Rav Yaakov bar Idi. Says Rav Yaakov bar Idi something very interesting. V'chi kol dibor v'dibor shaya Yoshua Yoshe v'doresh. Haya omer kach amar Moshe. Now let's understand this. Yoshua gets all of his Torah from Moshe. So that means every time Yoshua teaches, something comes from Moshe Rabbeinu. Do you think that every single time Yoshua conveyed a piece of knowledge, he said to his students, oh, and Moshe Rabbeinu said this, and Moshe Rabbeinu said this? No, he didn't mention Moshe Rabbeinu's name every time. Ella, Yoshua Yoshe v'dorish, when Yoshua would go ahead and sit and give the shir, the Yodin hakol shahat Torah shel Moshehi. Everyone knew that Yoshua's Torah was what? From Moshe Rabbeinu. There was no need for attribution. There was no need to say anything. It was understood that everything he knew from his Rebbe. So Rav Yaakov bar Idi says to Rabbi Yochanan, Af ata Eliezer Yoshe Vidoresh, when Eliezer gives a shiur, Hakol Yodin Shatora Shelchahi. Rabbi, everyone knows that Rabbi Eliezer gives a shiur, he is your Talmud. And therefore, ultimately, everyone knows that the Torah that comes out of his mouth is your Torah. Amar Lahen. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Mipnei ma ein aten yodin l'ratzos keben idi chaverenu. So at this point, Rabbi Yochanan turns to the other Rabbanim and he says, why don't you know how to make me feel better like Rav Yaakov Bar Idi? So we'll say what comes out is, so now the Gemara explains Rabbi Eliezer's behavior. So the fact that he didn't go to greet his Rebbe is ultimately because that was the Minhag Bavel, that a person of a lower stature or lesser stature would not greet someone of a greater stature, and therefore he couldn't walk by because walking by without a greeting would have been an affront. Furthermore, even though he did not quote his Rebbe every single time, there was no need to, because since he was his Rabbi Mufak, he was his primary Rebbe, he taught him the majority of his Torah, it was understood that when Rabbi Eliezer said something, it was really from the mouth of Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara goes weiter. My kuli hai the name the yemrun shmaite mishmein. Now I said, what is this whole thing that Rabbi Yochanan is so makbid that his Talmud Rabbi Eliezer say over the teachings in his name? I mean, what is it? Is this a covet thing? What is it? So listen to this. So the Gemara says he's not the first. Da'af David bikesh alei rachamim. David HaMelech asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu for compassion as well. Shnei Emar, Agura ba'ohalecha olamim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I want to dwell in your tent for all eternity. For all eternity. Achaseh b'seiser kinafecha sela. I want to go ahead and literally find shelter in the cover of your wings. So the Gemara says, 1 second. V'chi also al daito shel David. Now, when David says that I want to live in your tents for all eternity, I will say tents can mean a number of different things, but often on the most basic level, a tent refers to Ohel Shel Torah, refers to the Beis Midrash. I want to live in the Beis Midrash for all eternity. So, is it possible that David HaMelech is going to think that he's going to live for all eternity? Impossible. So the Gemara says, this is what David HaMelech meant. He says, Ezke sheyihiyu divarai ne'emar bebate knesios ubebate midrashos. What David HaMelech says is, you know what? I want eternal life, but not eternal physiological or biological life. That's not possible. But instead, what I want is the eternality of my words. And if I know that the words that I say in this world will ultimately, again, be remembered and will be used by those when I leave this world, that assures for me some level of eternity. So I'll say that. So the Gemara is pointing out of it. And by the way, this is the tie-in, because if you remember how this sugya started, Rav Shimon began by saying that we don't make grave markers for tzaddikim because tzaddikim don't need grave markers to be remembered. Their words are their ultimate memorial. Rabbi Yochanan, is getting very upset that what? That his Talmud Rabbi Eliezer is not going ahead and saying over teachings in his name. Why? Because the eternality that we have, Rabbi Osai, in this world is the Torah we leave behind. And Rabbi Yochanan is concerned that his eternality is being compromised. David HaMelech says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem, please make sure, Agura ba'ohalecha olamim, let me live in the tents of Torah for all eternity. Help me allow people to remember my words even when I'm gone. He goes on, Shimon ben Nezira, b'shem Rabbi Yitzchak Amar. Shimon ben Nezira, named Rabbi Yitzchak, said, Kol Talmud Chacham, listen to this, this is quite amazing. Kol Talmud Chacham, she'omrim dvar halacha mipiv ba'olam hazeh. Any Talmud Chacham who they say over halacha in his name in this world, svasav rochashos imo bekever. Listen to this. His lips literally move in the grave. So I'll say again, when you say over the words of a tzaddik, his lips literally move in the grave. Now, what exactly is the benefit to the person of lips moving in the grave? The idea is that he's part of the learning process as well. When you quote something in the name of something, that's why the Gemara says that kala omer davar b'shem onro mevi gula liolam. When you say something in the name of when you properly attribute a particular teaching, you bring redemption to the world. And I will say that means a couple of things. On one level, it also means that when you attribute something to the original source, what you're showing is that you're not learning Torah for your own kavod. Because if you want to learn Torah for your own kavod, what would you do? You would not attribute at all. You would take credit for having said this. But what attribution shows humility, shows that you're not learning for kavod, you're learning for the sake of ultimately learning. And furthermore, again, the geula is that you connect the living with the dead. Because in that moment, what occurs is I connect with the neshama of the person whom I am quoting. The lips of the deceased literally move in the grave. Shne'emar. Because the pasuk says, "V'chikeich kiyein hatov literally means like your palate is like the good wine. Dovev sifsei yeshanim. They move like the lips of the old. What does that mean? Ma komer shalanovim zeh. Just like we'll say, komer avanovim literally means a mass of grapes. Kevan shamaniach adam etzba'o alav. Miyad dovev. Now, we'll say again, if you have a mass of grapes, I guess if you're making wine. So if you have the grape mass sitting in the vat, and you push down on the mass, so the liquid, the wine bubbles up. Af sifso seyam shal tzadikim. So to the lips of the righteous. Kevan sha'omrim dvar halachim epiyam. When you say something in their name, shal tzadikim, sifso seyhan merachashos imayan bekever. Their lips move along with those learning in the kever. So the Gemara says mahana. But what is mahana alo? What is the benefit? Meaning, what is the benefit of the lips moving in the kever? Like what does that do for the deceased? Listen to this. So the Gemara says mahana alo. Bar Nazira says. Kadein dishasi kunditon. You know what the pleasure is? The pleasure is like when you have a good glass of kunditon. What's kunditon? If you look at the Tiklin Charatin, he says kunditon yayin im divash. This was a type of wine that had spices, a sweeter wine. So it had honey and a number of other ingredients as well. Rabbi Yitzchak says amar kadein dishasi chamer atik. Just like one who drinks a good aged wine. I will say, I think what he's referring to here is the following. You know, what happens when you have a good glass of wine, whether it's the kunditon or it's the aged wine? So the truth is, the beauty of wine is a good glass of wine brings a certain amount of contentment. Right? A person just feels content. So the Gemara is saying over here is that when you see something over in the name of someone who is deceased, ultimately what it brings a certain level of contentment to the neshama. It allows the neshama, really, if you think about it, allows the neshama to feel a sense of fulfillment. Remember, we also have this idea that wine also has the ability to satiate. So when you have the glass of wine, you feel satiated, but also what? You feel content. So too, when the mace knows that words of Torah are being said over in its name, Lamaisa, there's a sense of contentment. And the Gemara ends off by saying over here, also with the kunditun and the aged wine, even once you finish drinking it, the taste is left on the palate. Almost as if to say again, that's the beauty of leaving behind Torah, that the taste is left on the palate even when the wine is gone. The residual effects of the Torah that I taught remain even when I am no longer here. Rav Gidol Amar, Ha'omer Shmuel b'shem omro, Yira bal Shmuel kilo omid l'negdo. So also Rav Gidol takes us a step further. When you say over a halacha in the name of someone, or not just a halacha, when you say over a concept in the name of someone, you should try to visualize the person standing right before you. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, quoting the pasuk from Tehillim, Ach b'tselem yishalech ish. Literally, with the image of a person, a man should walk. So I'll say this is the idea that when you conjure up the image, when you conjure up the image of the person whom you are quoting, it gives a greater reverence to the teaching. So try to visual. Obviously, it only works if you knew the person or if you saw the person. But let me say again, try to visualize the person whom you are quoting. So Uksiv in the pasuk also says, let me just see if there was. Take a look. I will say, take a look at the carbon ha'eda just for one moment. Carbon ha'eda is on the right hand side. You see where it says Rav Gidol Amar Ha'omer Shmuel b'Shem Omra. Sorry for making you skip around. It's towards the top actually. It's about probably like 12 lines down in the short lines. Rav Gidol Amar Ha'omer Shmuel b'Shem Omra. Yira bal Shmuel kilo omid l'negdo. You should view the person who made the statement as if he's standing opposite you. Sha'al yedei kain yagid hadavar. I'm sorry, I just lost the place now. Sha'al yedei kain yagid hadavar al ofno. Therefore, you will be meticulous to say over the teaching in the right way. The ikar halimud merabo b'ri'as panim. Because we'll say, interestingly enough, the best way we learn from our Rebbe is to actually seeing him. Dechsiv v'hayu einecha ra'os esmaracha. We'll say here the Gemara is describing a fascinating dynamic, which is that often part of the learning experience is the human interaction. Not just hearing the information, but the actual human interaction. So therefore, if Gidel says that when you're going to say something in the name of someone, view it as if your Rebbe is right there before you, as if the person is right in front of you. That will help you say over the idea with greater clarity. So he goes on, Ksiv Rav Adam Yikra Ish Chasto, Zeh shar kol adam. V'ish emunim mi yimtza. So we'll say the Gemara quotes another pasuk. V'ish emunim mi yimtza, and a person of faith who will find. Zeh Rabbi Zeira. This refers to Rabbi Zeira. Dam Rabbi Zeira. Listen on tzrichin chashoshin l'shmaitei d'Rav Sheshes. We do not have to pay heed. We don't have to pay attention to the teachings of Rav Sheshes. Why? The hagavra miftecha. Because Rav Sheshes was blind. Gavra miftecha literally means he was a man with open eyes, which is a euphemistic way of saying he was blind. Take a look at the tickle in Charatin. V'gavra miftecha sagi nahar. He was blind. And therefore we have to be concerned that maybe he was not as careful with his teachings. So let's listen to this. So interestingly enough, Rabbi Zeira went so far to say that we have to be careful with the teachings of Rav Sheshes, because since Rav Sheshes was blind, the man says it's possible that his teachings are not as sharp. Amrali Rabbi Zeira, the Rabbi Asi, Chachim Rebbe lebar pasya. So Rabbi Zeira said to Rebbe, "Are you wise when it comes to the teachings of bar pasya? Da'at amar shmaita mishmei. You say over teachings in his name." But he was saying, did you ever actually see bar pasya? Did you ever actually learn across from him that you could quote his teachings? To which Rebbe responds, Amrale Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan Amra Mishmei. So what Rebbe responds is essentially, I learned it from my Rebbe, who learned it directly from Bar Pasya. So you're right, I don't learn from Bar Pasya itself, but it's okay. I learned in the physical presence of my Rebbe, and my Rebbe learned in the physical presence of his Rebbe, and therefore we have this issue or this aspect of sight when it comes to learning. Amalei Rabbi Zil Rabasi, Chacham Rebbe. Amrli Rabbi Zeira the Rabbi Asi. Rabbi Zeira said to Rabbi Asi, Chachim Rabbi Lerav, Da'at Amr Shmaisa Samishmei. Have you learned by Rav? You're so smart when it comes to teachings of Rav that you can go over and give over his teaching. So both say same thing. What Rabbi Zeira was saying was, you didn't learn in front of this person. You never saw him. How can you give over his teachings? Amrli Rabbi Adabar Ava Amr Mishmei. I learned under Rabbi Adabar Ava, and Rabbi Adabar Ava learned under Rav Asi, and therefore he can quote his teachings, and I learned from him. Fine. So the Gemara says, Ein dar she'ein bo leitzanin. Rabbi was saying, every generation there is leitzanos. Leitzanos is like mockery, right? So leitzanos really refers to not just simply cracking jokes. Leitzanos means trying to negate the importance of things. In every generation there's leitzanos. Even Doro Shel David, even in the generation of David HaMelech. Listen to this. It's actually a very moving Gemara. Mahayu prutze hador osin. The Rabbi saying David HaMelech had many, many enemies, and many people and I don't mean external enemies, I mean internal enemies, and many people who made his life really a living Gehenna. And people really they disparaged David HaMelech terribly. So what Mahayu prutze hador osin? What did the prutzim? What did the lowest people of the generation used to do? They would walk by the windows of David HaMelech. They would say to him, David, when are we going to build the Beis HaMikdash? When are we going to get to walk? When are we going to get to go to the house of God? So it's like they were taunting David. David wanted to build the Beis HaMikdash, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu told David he is not going to build it. Shlomo is going to build it for a variety of different reasons. David was not to build it. So people knew how much David wanted to build it, but they also know that God said no to him. So those who wanted to taunt him would taunt him. When are we going to build? When are we going to break ground? When are we going to go to the Beis Hashem? V'haya David Omer. David used to say, Afapi shemis kalach niyani say. I'm supposed to listen to these midos. David HaMelech says, you know what? I know that they're trying to bait me. I know they're trying to get me upset, but you know what? Yavo Elai means I swear, Im lo haisi samech b'divreihem. I swear that I am so happy to hear their words. Why am I so happy to hear their words? Because again, David HaMelech said, he was happy to hear that people wanted the Beis HaMikdash. Right? Even though they're doing it to taunt me, at least HaKadosh Baruch Hu, look at your children. Look how they want. If they're going to taunt me, let them tell me about the Beis HaMikdash. Look how much they wanted. D'chsiv samachti ba'omrim li Beis Hashem nelech. Rabbi say again, amazingly enough, David HaMelech quotes in Tehillim, this is in Tehillim 122, I used to rejoice when they said to me, let us go to the house of God. So this computer was written down. He was being taunted. He's being taunted, but yet he said, you know what, Baruch Hashem, at least they want the Beis Hamikdash. V'hayu, so David HaMelech, you say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when are we going to go to the Beis Hamikdash? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, V'haya ki yimalu yamecha v'shachavtas avasach. You know when we're going to build the Beis Hamikdash? When your days, David, are filled out, and you will lay with your fathers. When you sleep with your father's death, then we'll build the Beis Hamikdash. Amalek HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God said to David, listen, Yamim shleimim animon lecha v'lo yamim chaserim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to David, you are going to live out your full life, and I will not take away any of the days of your life in order to expedite the... Because remember, the Beis Hamikdash could only be built once David was dead and Shlomo assumed the monarchy. But God says, David, I'm not going to in any way lessen your lifespan in order to hasten the building of the Beis Hamikdash. Well, listen to how beautiful this is. I'm going to count for you full days, and not partial days. Klum Shlomo bincha yibana Beis Hamikdash el lahakriv karbanos sibor. Your son Shlomo is going to build the Beis Hamikdash, and what's going to happen in that Beis Hamikdash? They're going to offer out communal offerings. Chaviv alai tzedakah umishpat sha'ata oseh yoser min karban. But David, I have something to tell you. I appreciate the tzedakah, the charity, the chesed that you do, the mishpat, the justice that you hand out. I appreciate that more than all of the karbanos that will be offered in the Beis Hamikdash of Shlomo. I appreciate your chesed. I appreciate your mishpat more than karbanos. Shene'emar, oseh tzedakah umishpat nivchar laHashem mizevach. As the pasuk in Mishlei says, and this is Shlomo Melech, the one who built the Beis Hamikdash, reflects on this, and he says, you know what? I've come to realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves the one who does tzedakah and mishpat more than the one who just simply offers up karbanos. So as much as HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as much as David says, let's build the Beis Hamikdash, even if that comes at the expense of my life, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm not willing in any way to decrease your lifespan even by a day. We saw about say similar Gemara Masechah Shabbos. Because David, what you bring to this world, what you infuse into this world, a sense of tzedakah, a sense of charity, a sense of kindness, a sense of mishpat, justice, standing up for what's right, that's more important than all of the karbanos in the Beis Hamikdash. So you're going to live your full life. Again, David Melech lived a short life, but for him it was a full life. And when your full life is over, then will come the era of the Beis Hamikdash. Hadron Allah mitzarfin shkalim. We'll say shikoyach. 8:15 tomorrow. 8:15.